I don't know that I did.
It should have popped up on the screen. Lee, you might need to do that as host. Do you want to give it a try?
Why don't you get going and I will
Oh, I see it recording now.
Yeah.
figure it out. Yeah, I just pressed it. If anybody has a problem with us posting this recording, just let me know and we'll address that.
All right. I think we're finally ready. Margot and Christina, are you ready?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so this is an informal conversation, one that we planned before all of the challenging issues have arisen, but we think now is probably as good a time as ever. Thank you for those just joining. If you could please mute yourselves as you come in, that would be great. Thank you. So we thought now is as good a time as any, because with working from home situations and changes in our work priorities, I imagine some of us are having spaces of time that we could fill and maybe thinking of projects that could be done remotely, such as professional writing and professional literature. So I'm so glad to be joined with my fellow panelists, both Margot Note and Christina Zamon. And we're gonna kick this off with each of us giving a brief intro of ourselves, talking about why we got into writing and specifically writing a book, and sort of a fun way to dive into both the book and the topics that we chose. So with that, Christina, I'll invite you to go first because I think your slide is first. Do your
Okay.
intro.
So why did I decide to write a book? I guess I will say, gently coerced into it. I early on in my career, I was very active with the Lone Rangers Roundtable, and there was a lot of discussion at most of the roundtable meetings about needing some sort of guidebook, manual publication for people who were Loner Rangers, primarily because a lot of Loner Rangers, they were right out of school. They maybe didn't have a background or necessarily a degree. And a lot of them just needed a place to start. Where do I start? And at that point, I wasn't really ready to write, but as I gained some more of my own experience, that momentum just kept going. And so I pitched it out to my fellow Lone Rangers and said, hey, who wants to write a book? And they all turned back and said, how about you? So that's how I ended up writing the book. I put together the proposal. I wasn't sure if SAA was going to go for it. I went right to SAA thinking that was the most practical publisher for this type of thing. I hadn't really thought sort of beyond that to like Neil Schumann and some of the other publishers, because what I was proposing was more of a practical book, and I had a very clear idea in my head about how I wanted to format that book so that it was the most useful for the broadest possible group of people, seeing that they were all in different types of institutions. So they said yes, and here we are.
Excellent, thank you. And just as a reminder for those who popped in, we will send these slides out with the hyperlinks so that you can get access to all of these. Expect an email from Lee as our host. So for my part, this is my slide. I'm Rachael Woody, and for my part, getting into book writing, it was a natural unfolding, which was nice. I've always enjoyed reading and writing, and had done some articles and of course all of the different blog posts, etc., and was approached by Lucidia to write what was my first book, and that was A Survivor's Guide to Museum Grant Writing. And my partnership with Lucidia has been wonderful in terms of they commissioned the book up front, so I am compensated for my time and my intellectual property. I retain copyright to the materials, and they do the printing costs, etc. For them, it's a marketing mechanism, and so a lot of the time the book is given out at conferences or as a free ebook. So it helps both of us, both me and the company, to give these resources out to people who need them and to help do their jobs. I also very recently had an article published in the Public Historian, which is ran by the National Council on Public History. And that one was about the Hamilton exhibition in Chicago. And then I'm a regular contributor to both the Lucidia blog, but also the Archives Aware blog, which is ran by the Committee on Public Awareness. I do see we have some chats, so I'll pop over just to make sure things are okay. Oh, okay.
Don't worry, I'll monitor chats.
Thank you so much. Okay. So yeah, so that's how I got into books, and I'll hand it over to Margot.
Hi everyone, my name is Margot Note. I'm an archives and records management consultant, and I kind of have a weird mix of books that I wrote, so I actually have them here. So the first one, and it's going to be backwards, so it's Managing Image Collections, a Practical Guide, and then Project Management for Information Professionals. These were both published by Chandos, which was then bought up by Elsevier, which I'm not necessarily a fan of Elsevier, but it does definitely get those books out there. And I should say the first book, the Managing Image Collections, this came out of graduate papers I was writing for library science school. So some of those papers that I was figuring out actually kind of got expanded into this first book. Another book that is like Rachel's is from through Lucidia. So it's, again, it's backwards, but Mystifying Archival Projects. So it's talking about how to do project management for archives. This is something, again, that's used as a marketing vehicle. But what I like about this is that it's unlike the two first books that are very expensive. This book is like given out freely. You can download it. So it's getting that information out to people that they don't have to invest in it, but they get a lot of information. And then I have these two kind of connected books. So Creating Family Archives, this was self-published through Amazon. I wrote this a couple years ago, and because I wrote this book and I was promoting it, it led to the SAA book, Creating Family Archives, which is my most recent book. So I think what I can at least offer to the conversation is that, you know, I approached writing in all different ways. So I did kind of a traditional, the two first books are kind of academic, traditional royalty model. Lucidia is like a marketing tool. I was kind of paid outright, self-published, and then that self-publishing expanded into an SAA book. And the tone of the both Creating Family Archives is much more kind of everyday English versus the academic, you know, with lots of notes and figures and citations. So just different types of books, but also different types of tones and voices, and serving different audiences. And for my links, I wrote a post on my website about writing for career success. So really talking about, if there's one thing that I think I want people to get out of this is like anyone can write a book. You might not think you can do it, but you can definitely do it. And your voice should be heard. And then I talk about it a little bit about the writing process and creating family archives in the Archives Aware link that's on the screen. But I really think what I enjoy about writing and what I get out of it is that I learn about the subjects through writing. So it forces me, you know, I should be reading these articles and doing the research anyway, but because I have like a goal, it forces me to really do it. And by writing on a subject is how I actually figure things out. So I have a curiosity, but I figure it out. And by the time the manuscript is done, I know a little bit more about the subject. So, and that's my kind of thought process and what I get out of it.
Excellent. Thank you both. I'm going to pop over back to our title slide because we're not viewing any more slides, and I'm going to try and bring our windows back up. There we go. That way, at least there's some faces on my screen for people to see. So all of us in our intro, addressed sort of how we were approached or invited or how we sought out, and got into professional writing, which was my next prompt about the logistics. So I'm going to continue on and ask if you could share what was the most fun about the writing process with the various different methods, self-publishing, working with a publisher, etc. And then also what was challenging about the writing process, whether it was writing in general or if it was challenging working with the different types of publishing mechanisms. So if Margot or Christina would like to start us off.
Rachel, I'd like to just quickly, before I jump into that, I want to follow up on some of what Margot said. I forgot to mention in my slide, the second article I had published in Archival Outlook talked a little bit about the writing process and sort of my own experience. And as Margot said, it's really like anybody can do it. And I will say from my standpoint, I am not the academic writer. I can be if I need to be, but I would prefer more, I guess, a more casual style of writing, which is what I really focused on in my book. And as I mentioned before, I had a particular idea of how I wanted the book to be, specifically because it was really geared toward anybody, and knowing that there were a lot of people out there that didn't necessarily have the archival background. It was kind of aggregating a lot of information and trying to put it into more common language. But to answer your question, what was fun and challenging about the writing process, I think, so I'm about to embark on editing and doing a new edition of my book. I have a proposal with SAA right now, and waiting to hear back from them about getting that process started. But with the first version of this book, my proposal was submitted right before I went out on maternity leave. So I wasn't sure like how I was going to write this book with a newborn and juggling all these things. And by the time, it was accepted and everything kind of got into place and it was time to write, I was thinking, how am I going to find this quiet time? And it happened that I had about 2 hours a day where I was sitting on a commuter rail train. So I wrote, I wrote all of the initial draft just sitting on a commuter rail train. So that was really interesting. I'm actually going to kind of miss that with this second version because it was like the best like use of kind of that normally wasted time. So that was the fun thing for me. I just had like a little netbook and I had my outline and I was just typing away while, going to and from work every day. So anyway, I found that to be really fun. And then I just took off, days here and there to once I really started getting into editing and things like that. I would say challenging was kind of the time part, finding the time between full-time work, family, all that. Because again, by the time the book was coming out to be published, I was pregnant with my second child. So this book really fell kind of in between all of that. So there's a lot going on. So I think juggling all of those challenges, and just trying to find the time to get it in. But it was really fun. I got to talk to a lot of people. I have case studies in my book as examples. And so just coordinating those case studies, reaching out, talking to other people, whether it was actually physically meeting them or just talking to them on the phone. It was just such a great process. So.
I love that. Margot, how about you?
Sure. So I think the fun part is I like the revision part of it. So I don't really like right now I'm working on a book now that the chapters are done, but now it just kind of adding a sentence here or there. Like I love the idea of like printing something out, making those revisions. That's like the zhuzhing of the manuscript is like really fun, but like the initial draft is like not fun. What I do really like too is that I love when people have read my stuff or I'm reading something and I see my citation in something. It's such a good feeling that like, you know, I was working on these things and it's actually helping people. Like Christina's book, like that was really helpful for me when I was a loan arranger, and that was my first archives job. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. And it seemed like so much of the literature in our field is based on like large university archives where everything else is not really talked about. So I like that idea of both of the revision and the connection between the book and the stuff and connecting with people. And I also feel, you know, even like looking at people's names, like if I read their book, I feel like I almost know them. So that's a really like nice connection. The challenging part for me, what I think what I found most challenging is with creating family archives, was that there was a reader advisory panel made up of fellow archivists, which in the long run was a terrific idea because I had a group of really smart people really reading my manuscript. But I think sometimes it was like I'd be revising chapters and they would be looking at older chapters. And so it was almost like this stepping of like keeping up with me. And so I think a lot of times I'm thankful that I got some really good critiques. And sometimes those critiques, you know, seem personal because it's about my writing, but ultimately they made it a better book. And I was thinking, you know, I'd rather see all the problems in my manuscript now when I can correct them versus later when a reviewer is looking at it. So at the time I had to kind of put, it's kind of the fun and challenging part is the ego that's involved with like, I'm a published writer, like there's something people think that's like, ooh, but there's also an ego where it's like, ooh, I'm getting feedback on things and like, how can I incorporate this really good feedback without it like messing up my ego. So I thought personally that, you know, I always feel like I'm open to feedback, but I really realize it's like, ooh, I'm like really sensitive about that type of stuff. But ultimately it was really helpful. And it made it a much better book because I had everyone like looking out for me as I wrote the book. And what I find really cool too is I was like searching online for this today, and I found, and I reached out to someone who was doing it. A history organization in Minnesota was doing a series of events based on that book. So, and I had no idea. So I think sometimes when you kind of create something in the world, people pick it up and take it with them. You might never know the impact that this stuff has, but it's so cool to know that like I can write one thing, but other people can take this stuff and move it forward. Like I know with Rachel, with your grant book, I've given that link out to so many people that I've talked to, and I know that that is going to result in people getting grant money because of that book. That's like what's so cool about doing this work.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo so much of what Margot and Christina have shared. The exhilarating part for me is, funnily, it's sort of opposite to Margot. I love that content creation phase where like the page is blank and there's so much potential there. It's exciting versus overwhelming for me, which is fun. One thing that I found surprising through all of this in my journey is that I've been writing more the last few years, and it was only a few years ago I realized so much hasn't been written yet. You know, to both Margot and Christina's points, like there are still areas that could use literature, whether it's formal academic literature or like this is, you know, the pragmatic approach to getting it done sort of literature. And so while I used to think, you know, oh gosh, there's, you know, so many American Archivist volumes out there and so many books that have already been written, like what could I possibly add? Oh, somebody needs to mute. Thank you. So I say that because I think perhaps some of us who haven't jumped in yet, maybe they're feeling that too. And there's absolutely areas where you can either update existing literature or add a new take on it, or, you know, things have changed so much even in just these last couple of weeks that could have implications for how we do our work. And I just want to let everybody know that there's definitely opportunity out there. The challenging part for me, and Margot touched on this a bit, was the editing process can feel very personal. That was the hardest or the challenging part for me was, you know, when you create this thing, and especially because you will spend so much time with it and you have this vision of what you think it will be, it is hard when that's challenged or tweaked, even if it's for the better, which most of the time editing and people who do the work of editing, like, bless you, because it is needed. So definitely I appreciate the work and the patience that goes into that. So just know that it's normal to feel that it is personal, but it is helpful. And I would encourage everyone, you know, imposter syndrome is something that's so big in our profession in general. And when you're writing something that could be a definitive work, I'm sure it's probably normal for us to feel that also as an imposter. And so I encourage you to acknowledge that, but also push through it, because you are experts in your area of the world and what you're working on. So you absolutely do have something to contribute. One thing that I found surprising through this journey so far is that in writing so much lately and through different venues like the Archives Aware blog, which, quick plug, anybody can contribute to the Archives Aware blog. It's ran by the Committee on Public Awareness, which is a SAA appointed committee. So you pitch an idea. Rachael Seal is the current editor, but feel free to contact me if that's easier. I'll hook you up, but pitch your idea. We'd love to feature you on that blog. It is for you as members. But getting back to my point, one thing I found surprising with writing so much is then going to conferences and meeting people that I have never met before, that I know of, but that has read my book or has read my posts, and they will come up to me and start talking like we know each other, which I love. But also it will take me a couple minutes to realize where this person knows me from. And so it's just been a wonderful surprise, because it's connecting me to people that I haven't even met yet. And yet there's something that we have in common already. So that's been a lovely piece of this.
Rachel, I just want to follow up on that, because I have people come up to me, not so much anymore, but at least in the first couple of years after I published my book. And I had a colleague who said, "This means your archive's famous now." So I just, you know, I tell my colleagues, just go with it. Your archive's famous.
I love that. Excellent. Any thoughts on this before I move on to our next prompt? I don't want to cut us off prematurely.
I do want to speak just briefly to the challenge to your ego, because I know I have a friend who's an editor, and I remember I had gotten all the comments back and the feedback, and I had assumed that the 3 people that were sending comments back were all just other lone arrangers giving me feedback, but there was just this one that just seemed to be like so nasty. And I, you know, at least to me, I took offense to it. And my friend who's an editor said, "Well, you know that that third person is actually like an editor and not an archivist." And so after she explained this whole process, she's like, "Yeah, they always do that. You know, like any good publication will have, you know, your peer review people, and then they'll have your, you know, an actual like editor who's reading it from a different perspective. So they're going to catch, you know, the grammar, the context, all the things that, you know, the peer reviewers wouldn't necessarily catch." Because I was just so like offended by this. And once she explained it to me, I kind of came off that ledge and was like, okay, this is good. I need to accept this. And you know, it made my book so much better. And I, came to really appreciate that feedback.
I think there have to be some real value to having that outsider looking at your work, because we can get so in our heads about our own topics. And if you're only speaking to a bunch of other archivists who know the language, you might be undercutting somebody else's ability to sort of understand some of your primary messages. So having that outsider editor look at your stuff, I would imagine, is extremely useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one cautionary tale that I have related to editorship is, as Christina said, definitely try and understand, if it's a blind peer review, I guess you can't, but try and understand where your editors or peer reviewers are coming from, may be insightful. But my cautionary tale is, when you do begin to enter into a relationship with whomever is going to be publishing your content, make sure there is a conversation up front about an agreed tone and an agreed audience. When I first began writing for other people, I thought, had that conversation, but when I submitted the work, it was quite clear that there was different expectations on either side. And unfortunately, in this particular circumstance, I had archives mansplained to me, which was definitely a red flag for not working with them again. So make sure you have those conversations up front in terms of, what does this look like? What's the tone? Who is it for? Etc. Excellent. All right. My next prompt for us is for everybody who's joining us today. Many of them are looking to get into professional writing. Perhaps they're, have done a couple, or perhaps they're brand new. So for us who have been in it for a little while, what is our advice that we want to share with them? Whether it's writing a book, writing an article, etc. What's our advice for helping them get into it?
So this is Christina. I would like to say that one thing that I came across when writing my book, because I was aggregating, and I think it was brought up a little earlier, is there are still a lot of holes in the professional writing, and I think in some ways there are even more now with digital preservation, digital archives, just all of the social media, everything, and it moves so rapidly. That those publications that are coming out, they're almost, in some cases, and this is partly why I need to do an update on mine, is, the pieces that have to do with technology are changing so quickly. And so I do feel like, there's a lot to be said for, you know, and it's not just technology. I think just trends as well, whether it's, personnel issues, management, all of that stuff evolves over time. And I think there's just so much room for people. If you have a passion or an expertise or something, and you're just not finding that information in the current literature, I think that's where people can really come in and fill those gaps, because there are, and I feel like there are more and more gaps all the time in the literature. And particularly, we have kind of within our professional literature, there's sort of the standard theoretical, as a couple people mentioned, that kind of focus more on those sort of bigger entities that have the people and the money and the resources. Don't have that and are looking more for those practical applications. And whether it's a practical application of, how to manage, how to, deal with digital, etc. I think there's just a lot of possibilities out there for people to engage and get out there and write.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can add, I was writing down some notes as I was thinking. So I would suggest, if someone is thinking about like how to move forward, is just start small and start experimenting. So the way that I got into writing books is that I was writing book reviews for journals. And I basically just contacted cold email journals that were in, the field, and said, I'd love to review a book. This is my specialty, this is what I'm interested in. And then I started building relationships with editors, and people are always looking for people to do book reviews. And so that way I was reading for the profession. I got a free book. I was able to get my name in print. So for years, I was doing that a lot. And that's how the initial publisher reached out to me, because I think they just saw my name and they reached out to me. So start small in that way. Like book reviews, I think, are a perfect thing, that you get published, but you don't have to invest a lot of time and effort into it. Another way is blog posts, of course. So you can write your own blog posts. You can write, like as Rachel said, for SAA. You can do kind of a one-off blog post, or if you have an idea of what you might want to write about, you might write a series of blog posts. So in some ways, you're kind of writing an initial draft of a book, but it's not a book. You're just kind of experimenting. So you can figure that out. I'm actually a big fan of self-publishing. So I think that's a really fast and dirty way to get your information out there. Now, I know my self-published book, like I just wrote that in between a time I was laid off and decided to become a consultant. And so I know there's probably tons of errors in that book, maybe things I didn't forget about, but it gave people something it kept me busy, and it really did help a lot of people. So I'm a big fan of doing self-publishing on Amazon, etc. And it is a way that you can get a ton of profits based on how you get a huge percentage of profits versus royalties. And then the other thing I'd want to emphasize is writing for yourself versus writing for an organization. Now, of course, you can write stuff for an organization like blog posts. You can contribute to any type of publications or newsletters, but you have to realize like the organization owns that. And so they're going to be, the author. Your name might be in that, but like that's their thing. Where I would really say that if you're going to put in the effort of writing, and writing professionally, you want it under your name because you want that to be portable. So, I had a huge career shift where I was laid off a position that I was there for 10 years, and then I went into self consulting. And because when I left that organization, obviously I put a ton of work in that organization that stays with that organization, and who knows what's happening there. But because I wrote things like my book, it was portable stuff that gave me a reputation in the field. And so I know I'm an adjunct professor at one university purely based on because I wrote a book that was on that syllabus. And I approached them someone at a meeting and said, oh, are you looking for someone to adjunct? This is the book I wrote on this subject. And he knew exactly who I was. So I think sometimes getting that publication out there. So if it's a book, an article, blog post, book reviews, any type of publication, you're putting your name out there, which is ultimately going to help you. And especially because archival labor can be very precarious before all this happened, and now we're moving into a time where it's going to be very uncertain. This is a way that you can, I hate when people say branding or like the brand of you, but that's truly what it is. It's like somehow, because you write a book, which, writing a book is a big deal. But because you write a book, you are the expert. You are not everyone writes a book. So purely by you doing this thing puts you at a different level, makes you more competitive, makes your name out there. And even as Rachel said, you'll go to a professional, like SAA, and people will come up to you and they'll know you. And let's say you run for office or something, I'm sure I've voted for people for SAA purely because I recognize their name because I've read their books. So I think it's a way to really help promote yourself. And that's why it's so important to do it for yourself, not necessarily for an organization, but really focus on what is something that I can create that's purely for me. Mm-hmm. And, I think I read all this Sheryl Sandberg thing about leaning in, which I don't necessarily agree with. I don't necessarily think you should lean into a job, but you should lean into your career. So what are ways that you can help yourself, promote yourself, that is owned by you? You know, if you're going to spend all this labor and intellectual and it's a lot easier than people might think. I mean, if you have if you have gotten a master's, I mean, if you've got an undergraduate degree, if you've gotten a master's degree and you've written a thesis, you can write an article, you can write a book. It's just a series, you know, it's just writing papers, but connected papers that are longer. That's all it really is.
I love that breakdown. To echo that, that's how the grant book for me came about, which was my first book. It started out as a series of blog posts where I was asked to write about grants, and I think I've written at least 15 blog posts now about grants, but that made up the majority of the book content later on, was a more formalized, more fleshed out version of those blog posts I had done earlier. So it was a great way to sort of take baby steps into it. And by writing those blog posts, for me, the book invitation, it came through LinkedIn. As both Margot and Christina said, writing that professional literature, sharing it on your various different forums. And for me, I'm big on LinkedIn. And so people see that I'm active there when they're searching for a consultant or searching for someone. They see my content there. They see that I'm writing pretty frequently. And so definitely, as you get those things written, share them so that people can find them. Don't just let them live on your website quietly. I think one other thing that I wanted to echo that Margot said was protecting your intellectual property. So the difference of writing for yourself versus writing for someone else. And even when you're writing for someone else, there's still room in there to protect the intellectual property. It doesn't stop for Lucidia, like it's their branding, obviously. It is their book, I wrote it, but the content in there is still mine. The copyright is filed under my name, which means no matter what happens in the future, I can still use my content in ways that I want to because it is still mine. Another way this came up for me was when I wrote the exhibit review for the National Council on Public History's publication. They sent me a contract that was a pro forma signing all your rights away, literally, for that piece that I had written for them. And so I asked them, and it's just a simple question of turning around and countering and asking and saying, hey, I typically keep the copyright to my works. Is there a different version of this contract where I can keep the rights but grant you license to publish it and use it in the normal ways that you would? And they turned around and sent me a different contract, no problem. They just didn't offer it initially. So even when you're writing for other people, find ways that you can protect that intellectual property that you've created so that no matter what happens in the future, you can take that and use it again later. So I think that's my advice for that. Any follow-up thoughts from Christina, Margot, or Lee as our host?
Well, I did want to say something which I just came to my mind. I really want people, I want to hear from the archivists that are working in weird places. Like, I don't want to read another university, well-funded university department project with 5 archivists and graduate students up the wazoo. Like that's fine, but that's not interesting to me. Like, I know that there's so many people that are working with really interesting collections, maybe are working by themselves, are working in really interesting circumstances, and I'd love to hear about that. I think SAA and the profession itself talks a lot about diversity and inclusion, which is super important, but it's also, I think, diversity and inclusion of different types of collections and places and people that I think are important. And I think that's what kind of excites me, is when I hear about maybe a place that's doing something really wild. Maybe you're taking the best practices of the profession, but in your particular circumstances, you had to do something really different. And I think people love to hear that. And there's so many people archivists that are working in isolation or with small departments, and they want to hear how you figured something out. Like, we are clamoring for that. And so that's what's really exciting to me. It's like, and there's so many different ways to publish and publishers. So of course, SAA is, you know, top of the line of this profession, but there's a lot of different interesting smaller publications, self-publishing, all different diverse places where you can, that your book or your idea of a book can really really find a home. And so that's what's important to me. It's like, I want people that wouldn't think they could write something to write something and like give birth to, you know, and share what they're doing, because we need ideas, we need hope, we need to hear from people. And that's what I really want to encourage people to really think about, and to be brave.
Mm-hmm.
To, you know, it is sometimes hard to kind of put yourself out there as like, I'm writing, you know, do I actually know what I'm talking about? Like, am I making sense? But it's important to do it, and the benefits are really worth it, both for yourself but also for other people that can find the information helpful and use it in their own institutions.
Margot, in follow up to that, one of the questions that came through in the sign up sheet that I think you might be able to touch on is what print press or digital platforms do you recommend for publishing? And I suspect the underlying comment here is for self-publishing. So is there, I mean, I have no idea how one would begin to self-publish, but perhaps you could speak to that.
Sure. So there's multiple ways and platforms that you can self-publish, and it depends on actually what you're putting out there. So I know that there's some that are devoted to more image-based, like more kind of art books. But I chose the Amazon platform. Now, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of Amazon, but it was really helpful for me because I was thinking, for creating family. So with this book, the self-published one, this is going to a general audience. So I was thinking, there's people that are into family history and genealogy that haven't heard of SA, don't know what archivists are at all. And so I chose Amazon because it was just the easiest way that you could get both a print publication and an ebook, and it could be throughout the world. So I had people buying this book all over the place. And you can set, what I did like about it too, is that you could set the rate. Like, so I made it pretty cheap. So I think I made it about $12 because it is a smaller publication. I wanted to get it out there. And then I got, of everything that was sold, I got 60% of the profits, and Amazon got 40. And so what they did is like they printed on demand. So, you know, people would put in an order and then they would print it and they would take care of it and send it out there. And so I did that because I just thought that was the easiest option. And I was really focused on marketing. And something, I don't know if we'll talk about this later, is something to think about with publishers, is that publishers only publish books. They do very little marketing of the book. So it's on the author to market the book. So with creating family archives, both the initial one and a little bit of the newest one, I'm doing the marketing of it. So I'm doing the webinars that are based on it. I'm doing the Instagram.
Actually, Margot, you have a webinar coming up that pertains specifically. Do you want to give yourself a plug since we're talking about marketing?
Sure. So that's a great example. So I was thinking like, okay, how do I promote this book and help people? So I did it last Sunday and I'm doing it this Sunday, and I imagine I'll do it every Sunday as long as we're in this current hellhole that we're in. And it's, I think it's called Close Together, Far Apart, Creating Family Archives While Social Distancing. And it's an Eventbrite thing that you can sign up for. A lot of people are signed up for it. It's happening this Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I'm talking, based on that book, I'm talking about what you can do in your homes to organize your stuff. So it's for a general audience, even though I think there are some archivists and people that are like organizers that are watching it as well. But it's talking about what are the steps that you can take. We're given this really weird time of being in our homes, and archival projects are something that everyone wants to do but doesn't have the time to do it, and now you can do it. So I found it helpful to use that as a promotional device for the book. So you can watch the webinar, you can get a ton of information. I give a bunch of resources. You don't have to buy the book, but the book, the webinar is based on the book, and the book gives much more information. So that was an example of like, you know, and past books too, I've done some promotion, but definitely not as much as Creating Family Archives, because I knew that was for a very broad audience.
And so how will they find, if they just go to margotnote.com, will they find a link to the webinar?
Yeah, so if you go into, I'll update I have a, if you go into margotnote.com / Creating Family Archives,
okay,
is one of the things. I'll put a link, after this, I'll put a link to that where you can sign up for that webinar. I should do that anyway. But that's been really helpful to help people where, you know, people are really stressed out. And right now people want information, they want something to do, and they're much more open to, I think, webinars now than perhaps in the past. Yeah, so I think just circling back, it's the idea that, you know, the book itself is also a marketing vehicle. Like what Rachel was saying, like she wrote it for Lucidia. It helps, it's a lead generator for Lucidia. It also helps Rachel too, because people that might be interested in the software or whatever are like, oh, Rachel's an expert in writing grants, let's talk to her. So it's a great way to market yourself, market the book, market, you know, a software or whatever you're trying to sell or promote.
I want to get Christina back in here. I think she wanted to say something earlier.
Yeah, and then we have about, you know, maybe 10 more minutes that we can go. There are a few questions people have posted in comments, which we should address. But over to you, Christina.
Just really quickly, I just want to address two things that Rachel and Margot mentioned earlier. So I just talking about breaking things down into smaller chunks. That's really how I structured my book. In each chapter is really, I treated it almost independently and did it that way, made it easier. And to speak a little bit more toward the diversity piece, one of the things that I really wanted to focus on in my book, again, because I was trying to create a book that would reach the broadest possible audience, I needed to have content from the broadest possible group of archivists. So I purposely made sure I had, you know, at least something from a business archivist, a government archivist, a religious archivist, you know, really trying to bring in all those different voices. I just felt like those specific case studies not only illustrated what I was talking about in the book, but it also gave voice to those, you know, as Margot was saying, those smaller institutions, those really different types of collections and situations and things. I had a colleague ask me the other day about, you know, is this how archivists always do it? And I was like, no, you know, every single place is different. We don't operate all the same. We have to adapt to whatever our situation is. So I think bringing in those diverse voices into a piece is really valuable.
Yeah, and I want to, as a plug for independent archivists, the section, this is a conversation that we've been having in our steering committee. You know, just sort of like the full, you know, SAA is up here, And a lot of us working in the trenches independently are working on a lot of these small kind of crazy projects that require different thinking. And so we were actually talking at our last meeting about trying to do a webinar that really addresses this issue of diversity in a very sort of micro sense. So do you have anything else to add about that, Rachel? Or no?
At the moment, and I do want to respect the question time that you mentioned. So, Leah, if you want to kick us off with questions, we'll try.
Okay. I mean, there's just a few. Rebecca asks, how did you do the research to know what else had been written about your subject? I think she's maybe concerned about launching into a project only to realize that somebody else has already done it.
Yeah, for myself, I definitely check American Archivist to see what articles are out there, especially within the last 5 to 10 years, which you can do a search in the database for with your keywords. And then I do Google searches as well. You know, archives and what we work on is pretty specialty, so the results aren't overwhelming. So those are my 2 methods.
Okay.
And I should say that sometimes, like for the first 2 books I did, I had to actually write. A lot of times for publishers, you have to write like a pitch. So you're saying like what you're doing, and part of that is market research.
I see.
You're looking at, okay, what are other books that are popular in the field, and how is my book different? So there might be some books out there that, there might be a ton of books out there that have been written, but it's also situated like, you're going to talk about this plus ABC. So you're seeing what's on Amazon, what's been published in the last 10 years, what is maybe part of the canon that you can expand upon. Just seeing what's out there and then having your own unique spin on it.
And then Ryan, he asks, how would you all consider republishing or revising your work in light of technological or other advances? In his writing, a blocker sometimes, you might have to jump in here, Ryan. In particular on content digital asset management has been considering how the writing might seem dated after not too long. I see. Can you respond to that, or Ryan, do you want to hop in and
Sure. Sure. Thank you. You know, one thing that I've kind of thought about is sometimes in my writing, I almost consider it in a timetable. You know, within a few years, how will this look to, you know, our community, but, you know, more general readers? And I'm just wondering in your own writing, if you kind of approach it in the same way, or if there's been things you've written that you really want to go back to, and how you kind of balance that with your new writing.
So Ryan, to address that question, I mean, that's a big reason why I'm going back and revisiting my book. I had originally, when I proposed the book, I had suggested that the book have an electronic component. At that point, and most of that was just to update the resources, because I reference a lot of resources in the book, but also to provide some of those updates. But at that point, SAA rejected that piece of it. They wanted it specifically to be print, primarily because there were still a lot of archivists, and still are a lot of archivists, and they were particularly thinking about Indigenous archivists who don't necessarily have access to internet or easy access to internet. So they wanted it specifically in print. I have in my prospectus for the revisions, there's been some talk, like I said, the prospectus has been submitted, but I haven't, because of the changeover in editors right now, haven't had any follow-up conversations. But that is the biggest challenge, I think, especially with something like my book, which is kind of meant to be a broader look at the landscape, that includes digital and is referencing a lot of other resources that may quickly be obsolete.
Great. Well, we had one other, we had a comment about diversity relating to business archivists, which I think you addressed, trying to include business archivists in your Lone Ranger's book. I think we probably have time for one more question if anyone has one. Otherwise, we will say thank you for joining us. Thanks to you three for sharing your time and expertise with us. It was wonderful. And I will be sure to let everybody know once the recording is posted. And with that said, if anybody's had problems with it being posted, please let me know and we can try to edit you out. So again, a plug, if you have any ideas for future webinars, please let us know. We're always looking for good ideas. Margot, did you have something to add?
I think someone wrote in the chat that there's questions on the Excel sheet.
Yes, and I have been tracking them in relation to what you had to say. So I felt that we had addressed them, but I can review them again if you like. There were a couple of these sort of, go ahead, Margot.
I think there was one question about time management.
Time management, yes. How did you find the time when you're already working on other duties?
Yeah, so I thought that was a really great question. And so like Christina, I did a lot of the writing when I was commuting on the subway. I think there's always pockets of time. And I know that, you know, when I had a full-time position, there was pockets of time at that position where I could spend a little bit of time of writing. But I do want to say the way that I work that people might find helpful is I use the Pomodoro technique or the Pomodoro method. So no matter what's happening when I have a manuscript to write, every day I'll focus on it for 25 minutes and then I'll take a 5-minute break. And there's some days that's the only amount of time that I have to work on that book. And even that tiny bit of time, that tiny bit of concentrated time is going to propel the manuscript in ways that you would be surprised about. Now, there's other times where I have much more time to expand. You know, I could write for an afternoon. Sometimes that's rare, but I think kind of focusing every day on a set amount of time, you know, you're going to do an hour or 20 minutes or 25, you're always going to move the manuscript forward.
Another question that was on the Excel was, can you talk a little bit about the submission or acceptance process? Obviously, this is going to be different depending on the publisher, but do you have any particular insight you'd like to share? Or,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, or maybe Christina, working specifically with SAA might be an interesting thing to address.
So submitting the prospectus to SAA is pretty easy, I guess I would say. You do need to address, you know, I can't remember off the top of my head. There's certain questions that you do need to address in the prospectus. And I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but basically some of what Margot said about, you know, that market research, what else is out there, you know, why would this book be unique or why would they even consider publishing it? Some basics about, you know, what topics or topics will be covered, you know, why now, what format, you know, things like that. And once you submit that prospectus, it goes to the publications board, which meets periodically. I believe they send that out ahead of time. It's reviewed by the board when they meet. I think they meet quarterly. There's some discussion. I know with the first iteration, the discussion came back to me with some suggestions, changes, etc. Went back, I revised, you know, until the prospectus was accepted. I think at that point I only had one set of revisions before the prospectus was accepted. At that point, then you get contract. The contract lays out, you know, what you get paid, how many copies do you receive. I understand, although this is only from publishing with SAA, but also talking with other colleagues and stuff. But what SAA provides is fairly standard for like a nonprofit organization publishing type contract. It wouldn't be the same if I went to like Elsevier or self-publishing. So what you get is you don't get royalties with SAA. I will say that, and you are paid the sum in 3 parts. So you get paid when you sign the contract. You get one chunk of money. You get another chunk of money when you submit the first draft for review, and then you get the final chunk of money when it actually gets published. So that's kind of how that process breaks down.
Well, thank you again to all 3 of you. We've run out of time. I'm afraid we're going to get cut off by the SAA Zoom for some other random meeting. But thanks again. And I will send out Rachel's slides as well as a link to the microsite when the posting is, or when the recording is posted. So thanks a lot. And we'll hope to see you all soon. Everyone stay safe and stay well wherever you are. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.